September 1st, 1939. Dawn broke over the Polish border in a thin, silver light, the kind that makes the world look deceptively peaceful before it remembers what it really is. A German corporal named Fritz Voss leaned against the turret of his panzer, fumbling with a cigarette. He was 22, nervous, and slightly hungover. Behind him, engines grumbled like restless beasts waiting to be unleashed. The order had not yet come. The men stood around in uneasy silence, their breath fogging in the chill air, eyes darting toward the horizon. Fritz struck the match, cupped it against the wind, and for a brief moment, there was only the crackle of flame and the smell of tobacco. By the time he exhaled, history had already started moving. It wasn't his cigarette, of course, that began the war. That's just how he remembered it later, in fragments of guilt and confusion. The real beginning came seconds later, when German artillery thundered toward the Polish outpost at Westerplatte. The ground shook, the air tore apart. To Fritz, it felt like the earth itself had changed its mind about peace. At the same moment, in the Polish town of Danzig, a postman named Jan Kowalski was pedaling his bicycle toward work, unaware that his country was no longer at peace. He heard distant rumbling and thought it was thunder. When he looked up, he saw planes cutting across the clouds, sleek, black, and endless. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler sat at his desk, watching the clock. He'd given the order for the invasion at dawn, expecting a swift victory. "We are not waging war," he told his generals, "we are delivering justice." His words, as always, were delivered with theatrical calm. Outside, radio broadcasters scrambled to report the defensive action in Poland. In London, Neville Chamberlain still clung to hope that diplomacy might salvage the situation. He'd spent the summer believing Hitler's promises, now as fragile as cigarette ash. The contrast between confidence and catastrophe was staggering. Soldiers on both sides thought the war would be over in weeks. In Warsaw, schoolteachers told children to stay calm, that Germany wouldn't dare attack a sovereign nation. In the countryside, farmers finished milking cows before running for cover as Stukas screamed overhead. The world shifted from ordinary to unimaginable within hours. Fritz's unit advanced quickly through the Polish frontier, cutting through villages still half asleep. He felt the thrill of movement, the strange pride of being part of something vast. But when they reached the first town, and he saw the faces of the people, women clutching children, men too old to fight, his excitement faltered. One Polish boy, no older than 16, threw a stone at their tank. It clanged harmlessly against the armor, but Fritz never forgot the sound. It was defiance made visible. Jan, the postman, never finished his route that morning. A bomb fell near the square, the blast throwing him into a ditch. When he came to, the air was thick with dust and the smell of iron. He stumbled to his feet, bleeding from the temple, and saw what remained of his bicycle, a twisted frame, still spinning its wheel. He walked home on foot, his satchel empty, his uniform shredded, wondering what message he could possibly deliver now. News spread faster than truth. By noon, German radio celebrated the victory at Westerplatte, claiming Poland's defenses were collapsing. In reality, the Polish soldiers were still holding out, low on ammunition but unbroken. They fought for 7 days against impossible odds, led by Major Henryk Sacharski, who refused to surrender even when his men begged him to. "We fight because someone must remember," he told them. His story would be buried under propaganda for years, but among survivors his name became a quiet anthem. Fritz's division crossed a river by evening. The sun hung low, a dull red coin over the burning fields. Smoke rose in slow, heavy columns, blurring the line between sky and earth. He kept thinking of the boy who'd thrown the stone. Later that night, as his unit camped among the ruins of a farmhouse, Fritz took out a small notebook and wrote, "If this is glory, it smells like oil and screams." He tore the page out and burned it. Soldiers weren't supposed to think. In London, that same evening, the British government still debated whether Germany's attack was a limited action. Chamberlain hesitated, his voice trembling in the cabinet room. Perhaps there is still room for negotiation. His advisors stared at him hollow-eyed. They had heard the reports from Poland. Towns flattened, civilians fleeing. The next morning, Britain and France would declare war. But on this night, Europe hung in a strange silence between denial and duty. For the civilians, there was no silence. In Warsaw, air raid sirens wailed through the night. Families crowded into basements, clutching rosaries and ration tins. Jan found his wife there, holding their daughter under a blanket. "They said it won't last long," she whispered. He nodded, though neither of them believed it. Outside, the city glowed orange with fire. Across the border, Fritz lay awake under his tank, watching the stars tremble through smoke. The excitement was gone now, replaced by a hollow ache. His commanding officer, a man named Bauer, passed by and muttered, "Get used to it. By winter, we'll be in Warsaw, and then maybe home." Fritz nodded but said nothing. He thought of home, his mother's kitchen, the smell of bread, the way the church bells sounded on Sundays. Those bells seemed impossibly far away now, as if they belonged to another world. War, in its first hours, was still too new to comprehend. It had no shape yet, no logic. The soldiers didn't know they were entering a 6-year storm that would devour entire nations. They didn't know about Stalingrad, or Hiroshima, or the camps. For them, the war was just this: a morning that began with a cigarette, a river that smelled of fuel, and a night sky burning at the edges. By the end of the first week, Poland was collapsing under relentless assault. Refugees filled the roads, carrying suitcases, pushing carts, herding animals. Fritz's unit moved through them like ghosts, forbidden to stop, forbidden to help. Once, he saw Jan among them, limping, carrying his daughter. Their eyes met briefly, two men bound by the same war but standing on opposite sides of its madness. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. The silence said everything: confusion, fear, recognition. When Fritz looked back, the crowd was swallowed by dust. He didn't see Jan again. History, as it turned out, rarely pauses for introductions. It simply moves on, indifferent, devouring names and faces until all that remains are the facts: a date, a border, a statistic. But if you looked closer, beyond the smoke, beyond the propaganda, you could still find them. A soldier burning his words, a postman walking home without letters, a boy who threw a stone. That was how the war really began, not with speeches or treaties, but with human moments too small to record. Moments that, together, lit the fuse of the century. And somewhere, far from the front lines, someone still believed it would all be over by Christmas. They were wrong. The war had only just learned how to breathe. In the summer of 1942, the air in New Mexico shimmered with heat and secrecy. Inside a secluded army laboratory surrounded by desert and silence, Colonel Leslie Groves stood with his arms crossed, watching a group of scientists argue over bats. Real bats, hundreds of them, fluttering in a mesh-covered cage that smelled faintly of guano and gunpowder. Groves, a man of monumental impatience, found the entire idea ridiculous. Yet across the room, Dr. Lytle Adams, a dentist-turned-inventor, adjusted his spectacles with childlike enthusiasm. "Sir," Adams declared, holding up a tiny canister no larger than a lipstick tube, "this, attached to a bat, could change the course of the war." Groves frowned. It was not the kind of sentence he expected to hear in a military briefing. The plan was called Project X-Ray. Its logic, while eccentric, wasn't entirely insane. Bats, Adams explained, could carry miniature incendiary bombs, be released over Japanese cities at dawn, and roost in wooden buildings before detonating, turning the architecture itself into kindling. Japan's cities were built largely of wood and paper. One well-timed swarm could ignite an inferno greater than any bomb. "Nature as a weapon," Adams said proudly, as if unveiling a miracle of reason. Groves rubbed his temples. The world's deadliest conflict had already produced tanks shaped like turtles and bombs disguised as chocolate bars. But this was new territory. Among the team was Lieutenant Alice Warren, one of the few women engineers in the project. She joined reluctantly, drawn by curiosity rather than conviction. The war had pulled her from a quiet academic life, replacing lectures with blueprints and ethics with orders. Her job was to design the ignition system for the bat bombs. Each day she watched men laugh at the absurdity of their task, only to resume it with grim determination. "Sometimes," she wrote in her journal, "it feels as though the world has gone mad, and I am helping it along." Tests began that August at Carlsbad Army Airfield. Dozens of Mexican free-tailed bats, anesthetized and fitted with miniature charges, were loaded into small canisters and dropped from planes. The first trials went well, too well. The bats woke midair, scattered, and vanished into the surrounding desert. Minutes later, smoke began rising from the direction of the hangars. The bats, seeking shelter, had roosted in the buildings. Within an hour, parts of the base were on fire. The irony was devastating and hilarious in equal measure. Adams tried to frame it as proof of success. "It works perfectly," he shouted as firefighters scrambled to save military property. Groves wasn't amused. "Doctor," he said dryly, "if you burn down one more installation, I'll have you court-martialed." Elsewhere in the world, others were pursuing their own desperate inventions. On the Eastern Front, Soviet commanders were training dogs to run under German tanks with explosives strapped to their backs. The animals, terrified and disoriented, often turned around, returning to their handlers before the charges detonated. The result was chaos, tragedy, and the sort of moral corrosion that only total war could justify. Private diaries from Red Army trainers later revealed the psychological toll, men crying as they watched the creatures they'd raised become unwilling weapons. "We told ourselves they died for the motherland," one wrote, "but I think they died because we ran out of ideas." In Berlin, similar madness took intellectual form. Nazi scientists distributed methamphetamine tablets, Pervitin, to their troops, convinced it would create a generation of tireless super-soldiers. The results were immediate. Soldiers marched for days without rest, their eyes glassy and movements mechanical. Fritz Voss, the young German corporal from the Polish front, had returned to combat in France by then. He remembered swallowing the small white pill before an offensive, feeling his heartbeat accelerate until fear itself seemed like a distant concept. "You don't feel human," he later told a medic. "You feel like the gun, cold and ready." The army called it efficiency. History would later call it addiction. Across the Channel, British engineers pursued their own brand of chaos. They built the Great Panjandrum, a massive rocket-propelled wheel meant to roll onto beaches and explode enemy defenses. It sounded impressive on paper, but in reality, it behaved like a drunken god of war, zigzagging across test fields, veering wildly toward spectators, and collapsing in spectacular failure. When the prototype finally detonated prematurely, scattering parts across the sand, the watching officers burst into involuntary laughter. "Well," one remarked, brushing soot from his uniform, "at least it scared someone." Alice followed these stories through classified cables that circulated between Allied research divisions. She read them in silence, part amusement, part horror. It struck her that the entire world seemed united not by ideology, but by absurdity. Everywhere, humans were trying to outthink death with inventions that bordered on madness. Her own conscience wavered nightly between fascination and disgust. She found herself studying the bats in their cages, their fragile ribs rising and falling. "You don't belong here," she whispered once, as though they might answer. When another test was approved in December, she insisted on supervising it personally. The new incendiary devices were smaller, safer, or so the engineers promised. The night before the drop, Adams approached her in the lab, his tone unusually subdued. "You think I'm mad, don't you?" he asked. She hesitated. "I think desperation breeds invention," she said. "And sometimes invention breeds monsters." He smiled faintly. "Then let's hope ours are only small ones." The next morning, they flew over a mock Japanese village constructed in the desert. The sun rose blood orange as they released the canisters. For a moment, it looked almost beautiful, hundreds of small wings unfurling against the dawn. Then came the distant flash of fire. Roofs ignited. Flames leapt from window to window. Adams grinned like a man vindicated by the universe itself. Groves, watching through binoculars, muttered, "God help us. It actually works." The test was declared a success. But as the smoke curled upward, Alice turned away. The sight filled her not with triumph, but with quiet dread. Within months, the project was shelved. The atomic bomb program had taken priority, and the bad experiments, though functional, were deemed impractical. Adams protested, convinced his creation could end the war humanely. Groves dismissed him with a handshake and a sealed report marked classified. The bats were released, the cages emptied, and the desert fell silent again. Fritz, thousands of miles away, marched toward Stalingrad, his veins still humming with Pervitin. He no longer wrote in his notebook. Words seemed pointless now. The world had become a machine fueled by ideas too strange to believe and too real to stop. He thought often of the cigarette that had started everything, and how something so small could spiral into this endless madness. In her final journal entry, Alice wrote, "Perhaps the strangest truth about war is that it makes sense while it's happening. Only afterward does it sound insane." She left the project and never returned to weapons research. Years later, when the details of Project X-ray were declassified, the public laughed. Newspaper cartoons showed bats carrying bombs, as if the entire thing had been a farce. No one mentioned the fires that had really burned or the people who had believed they were saving the world. In the end, the absurd became history, and the tragic became comic. The line between genius and madness had been erased, redrawn, and erased again. And somewhere in the archives, a note remained in Groves's handwriting: Project X-ray, inefficient but imaginative. It was the closest thing to an epitaph the idea would ever receive. The war moved on, leaving its strangest dreams buried in desert dust, waiting for someone, someday, to wonder how far humanity will go to win, and what it loses along the way. June 5, 1944. Rain drifted across the fields of southern England like a curtain, soft but relentless, as Lieutenant Jack McAllister stared at the rows of inflatable tanks gleaming wet under the floodlights. They looked absurd, childish even, like parade floats waiting for a festival no one wanted to attend. Yet by morning, those rubber beasts would become one of the most important illusions in modern warfare. Jack tugged his coat tighter, watching the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known only to a few as the Ghost Army, prepare their stage. "You ever think," said Private Eddie Parker, a wiry kid from Chicago with an artist's hands and a comedian's mouth, "that we might be the only soldiers in history ordered to lie for a living?" Jack grinned faintly. "If it keeps the real boys alive, I'll tell every lie in the book." Their mission was simple in design, impossible in execution: create an entire phantom division along the French coast to deceive the Germans into believing the Allied invasion would strike elsewhere. Using inflatable tanks, sound recordings, fake radio transmissions, and elaborate stagecraft, they would convince German reconnaissance that thousands of troops were gathering in Pas-de-Calais, far from Normandy. Jack, a former stage designer from New York, had been recruited precisely for this skill. He understood how light, distance, and imagination could turn nothing into something. His war wasn't about bullets or blood, it was about illusion. Inside a camouflage tent, Captain Ralph Ingersoll, the unit's commanding officer, outlined the operation one last time. "Gentlemen, deception is a weapon," he said, his tone measured, almost theatrical. "If the Germans think an army exists, it does, at least for as long as we need them to believe it." Maps fluttered in the damp air as he pointed to coordinates. "We'll use sonic trucks to simulate movement. Inflate the armor here, here, and here. Radio operators, feed them chatter about supplies, reinforcements, anything to sound busy." He paused, scanning their faces. "Our goal isn't victory. It's persuasion." Eddie raised a hand. "Sir, what happens if they catch on?" Ingersoll smiled thinly. "Then we become very real, very fast." The next night, under moonlight filtered through clouds, the Ghost Army moved like stagehands before opening night. Men hauled rubber tanks into position, securing them with ropes against the wind. Engineers wired loudspeakers to trucks, testing pre-recorded engine noises that rumbled across the fields like a distant storm. From above, it looked, and sounded, like an army on the move. Jack stood atop a jeep, directing angles and lighting like a director composing his final act. He caught his reflection in a puddle and wondered when he had last slept without dreaming of curtains and applause. The first real test came 3 nights later. Reconnaissance planes droned overhead, their cameras capturing the decoy encampment in perfect detail. The men froze, barely breathing. Jack watched the planes vanish into the clouds and exhaled. "We just fooled the Luftwaffe," Eddie whispered, disbelief edging into pride. But pride came with a strange weight. They were artists performing to an audience that couldn't clap, actors in a play that would never be acknowledged. The better they succeeded, the less anyone would ever know they existed. Between operations, Jack wrote letters he never sent. One was to his younger sister, a painter in Brooklyn. "You'd laugh if you saw our work," he wrote. "We sculpt shadows and paint ghosts. It's the only war where art supplies are top secret." Another letter, torn and unsent, was to the girl he'd left behind. "If I come back," he wrote, "I'll tell you about the night we made the moon believe there was an army below it." Eddie, on the other hand, coped through humor. During one long night of assembling fake artillery, he whispered, "You know what this is, Jack? The world's biggest puppet show. Except if the strings break, people die." Jack chuckled softly but didn't reply. He understood too well. Every sound they played, every shadow they cast, was a promise to real soldiers across the channel, men who would storm beaches in hours while the ghost army danced in silence to keep the enemy's eyes elsewhere. When news arrived that the D-Day landings had begun, the camp erupted in quiet cheers. They'd done their part. Reports from intercepted German communications confirmed the deception had worked. Enemy divisions remained stationed far from Normandy, expecting the main invasion at Calais. Jack allowed himself a moment of pride. For once, his craft, the art of illusion, had saved lives instead of merely entertaining them. But the war wasn't over, and neither was their mission. Weeks later, they were redeployed to France, trailing the advancing Allied lines. Their task, misdirect the Germans again, this time to protect General Patton's real movements. The French countryside smelled of wet earth and cordy. Villages half in ruins watched them pass. An army that wasn't an army, soldiers carrying rubber instead of rifles. At night, Jack sat by the road sketching bombed churches, the outlines of broken towers. "You're still an artist," Eddie said one evening, glancing at the drawings. Jack shook his head. "No. Just trying to remember what wasn't destroyed." Their deceptions grew more elaborate. They used speakers to simulate entire battalions marching through darkness, switched license plates on vehicles to create the illusion of multiple divisions, and set up fake command posts with dummy generals. The Germans fell for it again and again. But success came at a cost. Each illusion meant real soldiers were somewhere else, fighting and dying unseen. Jack began to wonder if creating ghosts also made them ghosts themselves, men without witnesses, whose victories could never be claimed. During one operation near Metz, a German artillery unit, fooled by their signals, shelled their position. The first explosion tore through the camp, scattering debris and shattering the illusion of invincibility. Jack dragged Eddie behind a jeep as dirt rained down around them. "Guess they figured out the show," Eddie gasped. "Then we improvise," Jack said, though his hands trembled. They worked through the night, relocating the decoys, amplifying fake transmissions, making the enemy believe reinforcements had arrived. By dawn, the shelling ceased. They had survived by lying louder. When the war began to tilt decisively toward the Allies, the Ghost Army kept working, moving from one illusion to another like wandering performers. They received no medals, no public recognition, only classified memos and silence. But among themselves, they knew. They had fought not with violence but imagination, and in a world drowning in blood, that felt like a small redemption. Eddie was killed weeks before the war's end, caught in a stray explosion while setting up equipment near the Rhine. Jack buried him beside a blown-out barn, marking the grave with an empty sketchbook. "You always wanted applause," he murmured. "This will have to do." That night, he stood alone by the river, watching the moonlight ripple across the water, thinking of how illusions fade when the lights go out. When victory finally came, Jack returned home unnoticed, his service sealed under official secrecy. He took up designing sets again, building stages for Broadway shows that people applauded without knowing they were applauding a man who once built illusions that saved armies. Sometimes, while adjusting a spotlight or painting a backdrop, he'd pause and smile faintly, hearing in memory the low hum of engines and Eddie's voice saying, "We're the only soldiers who fight with shadows." He never spoke of the ghost army, not even to his sister, who wondered why her brother's art always carried a trace of sorrow. But on quiet nights, when the world outside his window seemed too peaceful to be real, Jack would think of the rubber tanks gleaming under the rain, the false battalions whispering across fields, and the strange, holy truth of what they'd done, that in a war defined by death, they had fought by pretending to live. April 30th, 1943. The morning tide rolled against the rocky coast of Huelva, Spain, pulling fragments of seaweed and driftwood onto the sand. Fisherman Jose Antonio had been out since dawn, his small wooden boat cutting through the mist when he noticed something floating in the water ahead. At first, he thought it was a seal. Then the shape turned, and the pale face of a man surfaced, uniformed, lifeless, tethered to a briefcase by a thin chain. Jose froze, the oars dripping in silence. He whispered a prayer before hauling the body aboard. By the time he reached the shore, the news had already begun its strange journey through history. The body, he would later learn, wasn't what it seemed. 200 miles away in London, in a dimly lit office under Whitehall, Lieutenant Commander Ewen Montagu adjusted his tie before reading the morning report. His creation, the dead man Jose had found, was finally in play. Montagu was a naval intelligence officer, brilliant, sardonic, and dangerously fond of impossible ideas. Across the desk, his partner Charles Cholmondeley, lanky and perpetually disheveled, grinned through exhaustion. "If the Spanish hand him over to the Germans," he said, "we've just rewritten the war." Montagu nodded, his voice low but certain. "Let's hope our corps can keep a secret." Their plan, code-named Operation Mincemeat, had been born from desperation. The Allies needed to mislead Hitler about their next move in the Mediterranean. The real invasion would strike Sicily, but if they could convince the Germans it was Greece, they could save tens of thousands of lives. The trick was to make the lie irresistible. So they created a man, Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, a complete identity down to the last detail. A photograph of a fiancée in his wallet. Receipts for a recent dinner. Even an overdue bill for a new shirt. "A man is only as real as his paperwork," Montagu had said, half to himself. The corpse itself had come from a London morgue, a homeless man who died of pneumonia. In death, he became the perfect spy. They dressed him in uniform, attached the briefcase, and filled it with falsified documents, letters between British officers detailing a fake invasion of Greece and Sardinia. If the Germans believed it, they would divert their forces and leave Sicily open. Every stitch, every ink stain, every signature was part of the performance. "It's theater, really," Montagu remarked once. "Except the audience can kill you if they don't like the show." In Madrid, the body was turned over to Spanish authorities. Within days, German intelligence agents obtained photographs of the documents. The trap had been sprung. Montagu waited anxiously for confirmation, pacing the narrow hallways of MI5 like an actor awaiting reviews. Weeks passed. Then came the signal: Berlin had taken the bait. German troops began redeploying, fortifying Greece while weakening Sicily's defenses. The deception had worked. Yet beneath the triumph, Montagu felt an unease he couldn't name. He kept thinking about the dead man, about how they had built a life for him out of fragments and lies. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between meetings, he found himself wondering who the man had really been before he became Major Martin. Did he have family? Was anyone looking for him? "We gave him purpose," Cholmondeley said when Montagu voiced his doubts. "He's done more for the war dead than most of the living." Montagu smiled thinly, but the words didn't soothe him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had stolen not just a body, but a story. When the invasion of Sicily began that July, it unfolded almost exactly as they had hoped. German divisions were caught off guard, unprepared for the real assault. Casualties were far lower than projected. Allied troops moved quickly, capturing key ports within weeks. Churchill, delighted, sent Montagu a personal note: "You have saved many lives with your imagination." Montagu tucked it into his jacket pocket but never framed it. To him, Victory felt strangely hollow. He had always believed in logic and intellect, in the sharp edges of reason. Yet now he realized the war was being shaped as much by luck and illusion as by strategy. The success of Operation Mincemeat made its way through Allied circles, though few knew the details. A dead man fooled Hitler, one officer joked at a dinner party. Montagu laughed politely but left early, the sound of the waves from Huelva haunting him like a confession. He began visiting the morgue late at night, staring at the covered shapes under white sheets, thinking of all the stories that ended before they could begin. Cholmondeley tried to keep the mood light. "You worry too much," he said over pints one evening. "History will remember the outcome, not the means." "Perhaps," Montagu replied. "But history also forgets who paid the bill." Months later, the Germans finally discovered they'd been deceived. By then it was too late. Sicily had fallen, and the tide of the war was shifting. In Berlin, furious reports circulated blaming the Abwehr for incompetence. Hitler himself reportedly shouted, "I will not be fooled by English trickery again." Montagu read the transcript and allowed himself a grim smile. "Good," he murmured. "That means we did it right." But victory brought no peace. He dreamed often of the fisherman in Spain, of the body drifting through cold salt water, face turned toward the sun. In those dreams, the man always spoke, but Montagu could never hear what he said. The guilt, though irrational, remained like a stone in his chest. He'd crafted an identity so perfect it had fooled nations, yet he couldn't name the real man who bore it. In 1945, after the war ended, Montagu visited a small cemetery in Huelva where the body had been buried under the name Major William Martin, Royal Marines. The grave was modest, the grass overgrown. He stood in silence, the air heavy with salt and birdsong. "You one old chap," he said softly. "You saved lives. And no one will ever know your name." A wave crashed against the distant rocks, and for a moment, it sounded like applause. He turned to leave, but something in him lingered, the awareness that the entire war, with all its might and machinery, had often hinged on fragile, human absurdities. A cigarette, a bat, a balloon, a dead man with a briefcase. History wasn't a march of reason, it was a collage of accidents dressed as intention. And that, he realized, was both terrifying and beautiful. As he walked back toward the car, the sun broke through the clouds, scattering light over the sea. He thought of the young officers still alive because of one impossible plan and felt, at last, a quiet pride. But behind that pride lay an unspoken truth. Wars are not only won by heroes, but by ghosts, those who never knew they were fighting. Back in London, he sealed the final report of Operation Mincemeat, stamped top secret, and locked it in a drawer. The war was over, the lie complete, and the world had already begun forgetting. He sat down, removed his hat, and whispered to the empty room, "Rest easy, Major. The story's yours now." Then he turned off the light. The file, the grave, the man, they all became part of the silence that followed victory, proof that sometimes the most extraordinary truth begins with a single, deliberate lie. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden piece of history, the strange, brilliant deception that changed the course of World War II, make sure to leave a like to support the channel. Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories and forgotten moments from the war that shaped our world. And let me know in the comments, what surprised you most about Operation Mincemeat? Your thoughts and curiosity keep these forgotten war stories alive.